Ellie Thompson had perfected her routine in the 5 years since retirement. At 68, the former history teacher found comfort in predictability: breakfast in her small backyard garden, afternoons with a good book, and weekly dinners with her daughter Samantha and teenage grandchildren. Her Victorian home in Willowbrook, Virginia was filled with family photographs that told the story of a well-lived life. James, her husband of 40 years, had been gone for a decade now, but his presence lingered in the silent spaces between her careful routines. The only oddity in her meticulously maintained home was a lighter rectangle on the faded wallpaper in the living room, a space where a photograph once hung, removed years ago for reasons Ellie never discussed. "Grandma, why don't you hang something new there?" her grandson had asked once. "Some spaces are meant to stay empty, sweetheart," she'd answered with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Willowbrook itself was a picture-perfect small town, with tree-lined streets and historic buildings that attracted tourists each fall. The town was preparing for its 150th anniversary celebration, and Samantha, as a member of the historical committee, couldn't stop talking about it during their Thursday dinners. "We're going to honor our founding families and the traditions that made Willowbrook what it is today," Samantha had announced just last week, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "It's going to be the biggest celebration this town has seen in decades." Ellie had nodded and smiled, though something about the word traditions had always stirred a vague discomfort she couldn't quite name. As a history teacher, she'd spent decades teaching the town's carefully curated past to generations of students. Yet sometimes, standing before her classroom, an unexplainable hesitation would catch in her throat when discussing the town's proud heritage. The phone rang at 3:17 a.m., shattering the silence of Ellie's bedroom. She fumbled for the receiver, heart-racing. Middle-of-the-night calls never brought good news. "Mrs. Eleanor Thompson?" a man's voice asked. "Yes, speaking," she answered, her mouth suddenly dry. "I apologize for calling at this hour. My name is Marcus Reynolds, an attorney from Richmond. I'm handling the estate of Charles Montgomery, who passed away last Tuesday." Ellie frowned in confusion. "I'm sorry, but I don't know any Charles Montgomery. He was your great-uncle, Mrs. Thompson. Your grandmother Josephine's uncle by marriage." Ellie sat up straighter. Her grandmother had rarely spoken about her extended family. "Mr. Montgomery left explicit instructions that you be notified immediately upon his death. He has left you something, a substantial inheritance, yes, but more importantly, a sealed box with instructions that only you should open it." "There must be some mistake," Ellie said. "I never met the man." "No mistake, Mrs. Thompson. He was quite specific." The lawyer paused. "He said it contains information that will change everything you believe about your family." A chill ran down Ellie's spine that had nothing to do with the night air. "Can you come to my office tomorrow morning? The box has been in our firm's safekeeping for over 30 years, with strict instructions about its handling." Ellie agreed, too stunned to refuse. After hanging up, she sat motionless in the dark. Charles Montgomery. The name triggered no recognition, just an inexplicable sense of dread. She walked to her living room and stared at the empty rectangle on the wallpaper. Why would a man she'd never met leave her a mysterious inheritance? What secrets could be so important they needed guarding for decades? Sleep didn't return that night. As dawn broke over Willowbrook, Ellie watched from her porch as the town slowly came to life, shopkeepers raising their blinds, joggers on their morning routes, all blissfully unaware that her carefully ordered world was about to change forever. Have you ever received a mysterious call that promised to reveal long-buried family secrets? Share in the comments which city you're watching this incredible story from. That's just beginning. The next morning, Ellie parked outside a sleek office building in downtown Richmond. The law firm of Reynolds and Associates occupied the entire 10th floor, with views overlooking the James River. As the elevator climbed, Ellie's stomach knotted with unexpected anxiety. Marcus Reynolds met her at the reception desk, younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with kind eyes that contrasted with his formal demeanor. "Thank you for coming so promptly, Mrs. Thompson," he said, guiding her to a conference room where a polished wooden box sat centered on the table. It was smaller than Ellie had imagined, about the size of a shoe box, crafted from dark walnut with brass hinges that had tarnished with age. A small silver padlock secured the lid. "Charles Montgomery left this in our care 37 years ago," Reynolds explained, handing her a small envelope. "Inside you'll find the key and his personal note to you." Ellie opened the envelope with trembling fingers. The key was tiny and silver, attached to a yellowed note card that read, "For Eleanor Thompson. The truth, even when it comes late, is the only path to redemption." "Did he know me?" Ellie asked, confused. "He knew of you," Reynolds replied carefully. "Charles followed your family from a distance for many years." Taking a deep breath, Ellie inserted the key and unlocked the box. As she lifted the lid, she noticed a dark stain on the inside of the cover. It looked disturbingly like dried blood. The contents were few but meticulously preserved: a leather-bound diary, a bundle of yellowed letters tied with faded ribbon, and a black-and-white photograph protected by an envelope marked, "What should have been, not what they said it was." With shaking hands, Ellie removed the photograph. It showed a wedding couple, a tall, handsome black man about 35 years old, looking adoringly at his bride, a young white woman no older than 21. Ellie gasped. Though she'd never seen her grandmother so young, the bride's face was unmistakably Josephine's. She turned the photo over. Written in faded ink, "Marcus and Josephine Montgomery, June 12, 1957. Josephine's maiden name, Barrett, had been crossed out and replaced with Montgomery. "This can't be right," Ellie whispered. "My grandmother was married to Frank Williams. He was white. He was my grandfather." As if in answer, a newspaper clipping slipped from between the diary pages. The headline blazed in bold type, "Tragedy after interracial wedding, young couple dies under suspicious circumstances just 20 minutes after ceremony." The date matched the one on the photograph. The names matched those of the bride and groom. Ellie felt the room spin around her. "My grandmother didn't die in 1957, she said, her voice barely audible. "She lived until I was in college. And she was married to Frank Williams my entire life." Reynolds leaned forward. "That's part of what Charles wanted you to discover, Mrs. Thompson. The official story and the truth are very different things." Ellie stared at the photograph again. The happiness on both faces was undeniable. Marcus Montgomery's eyes shone with pride and love as he stood beside Josephine. "Who was he?" she asked. "Who was Charles Montgomery to this man?" "Charles was Marcus's younger brother," Reynolds answered softly. "He was at the church that day, one of the few witnesses to their marriage. He spent the rest of his life collecting evidence about what really happened that night." "And why me? Why leave this to me?" Reynolds hesitated. "He believed you were the only one who would have the courage to do what needs to be done." "Which is what?" "To reveal the truth about what really happened that night." Ellie looked back at the photograph, at her grandmother's radiant young face beside a man she'd never known existed. She thought of the empty space on her living room wall, the missing family photograph that her grandmother had removed decades ago. "How much more is there?" she asked. "That's for you to discover," Reynolds replied. "Charles left enough money in his will to fund a thorough investigation, should you choose to pursue it. He believed the truth shouldn't die with him." As Ellie carefully repacked the box, her mind raced with questions. Her grandmother, the quiet, dignified woman who had helped raise her after her mother's early death, had a secret first husband no one had ever mentioned. A marriage that apparently ended in tragedy just 20 minutes after their vows. And somewhere in this box lay the answers to what really happened on that June night in 1957, answers that someone had gone to great lengths to bury. Back home in Willowbrook, Ellie placed the wooden box in the furthest corner of her bedroom closet, beneath winter blankets she rarely used. Out of sight, out of mind, that was her plan. Whatever secrets it contained had remained buried for over 60 years, surely they could stay buried a little longer while she gathered her thoughts. She tried to resume her normal routine, but found herself staring at family photos, studying her grandmother's face for some hint of the young woman who had married Marcus Montgomery. The prim, proper widow she had known gave no indication of a passionate young bride who had defied social conventions. That night, Ellie's sleep was fractured by vivid dreams. She saw an old car plunging into dark waters, heard muffled screams, glimpsed faces distorted with rage in the reflection of headlights. She woke drenched in sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs. The dream returned the following night, and the next. Each time, the images grew clearer, more disturbing. By Thursday, she was exhausted, dark circles shadowing her eyes. "Mom, are you sick?" Samantha asked the moment she arrived for their weekly dinner. "You look terrible." "Just not sleeping well," Ellie replied, forcing a smile. "Nothing serious." Over dinner, she nearly mentioned the box, the photograph, the mystery of a grandmother different from the one they had known. But Samantha was buzzing with excitement about the upcoming town celebration. "We've finalized the exhibition on Willowbrook's founding families," she announced proudly, spreading brochures across the table. "We're giving special recognition to William Barrett, your great-grandfather, Mom. Did you know he established the town's first bank and helped write our original town charter?" Ellie's fork clattered against her plate. Barrett. It was the maiden name crossed out on the wedding photograph, replaced with Montgomery. "Are you sure you're okay?" Samantha frowned. "Fine," Ellie managed. "Tell me more about the exhibition." As Samantha detailed the plans to honor the values and traditions established by William Barrett and his contemporaries, Ellie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dining room temperature. If Josephine Barrett had married Marcus Montgomery against her father's wishes, what role had William Barrett played in what happened after? That night's dream was the most vivid yet. She saw her grandmother's face clearly, young, terrified, screaming a name as she struggled in churning waters, "Marcus." Ellie jolted awake with her own scream echoing in the empty bedroom. Shaking, she switched on the bedside lamp and froze. The wooden box sat on her dresser. She was absolutely certain she had hidden it in the closet beneath the winter blankets. Yet there it was, lid slightly ajar, as if inviting her to look inside again. More disturbing still, a trail of what appeared to be fresh water droplets led from the box to her bedroom door, as if someone or something dripping wet had carried it there. Ellie's rational mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps she'd moved the box herself and forgotten. Maybe she'd knocked over a glass of water earlier. But deep down, she knew better. She approached the box cautiously, half expecting it to move. When she touched the wood, it felt cool and slightly damp. Inside, the wedding photograph lay on top of the other contents, Marcus and Josephine's faces staring up at her. "What do you want from me?" she whispered to the empty room. No answer came, but as she picked up the photograph, she noticed something she'd missed before. In the background of the wedding picture, partially obscured by shadows, stood a young man who bore a striking resemblance to Marcus, likely Charles Montgomery. His expression was not celebratory but watchful, concerned. Ellie sat on the edge of her bed, the photograph trembling in her hands. She could no longer pretend this was someone else's mystery, someone else's pain. Whatever had happened to Marcus and Josephine Montgomery was crying out to be uncovered, and somehow, she had been chosen to do it. She thought of Samantha's enthusiastic plans to celebrate William Barrett's legacy, of the town preparing to honor traditions that might have been built on violence and lies. The truth, even when it comes late, is the only path to redemption. The words from Charles Montgomery's note echoed in her mind. It wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about the present, about who they were as a family, as a community. Ellie placed the photograph back in the box and closed the lid. Sleep wouldn't return tonight, but clarity had. In the morning, she would begin searching for answers, no matter where they led. Sunday morning dawned misty and cool as Ellie drove to the east side of Willowbrook, the historically black section of town that she, like most white residents, rarely visited. Her destination was a small Victorian house on Maple Street, home to Grace Washington, the oldest living resident of the community at 97 years old. Ellie had done her research. If anyone might remember Marcus Montgomery and what happened in 1957, it would be Grace. Known for her sharp memory and no-nonsense attitude, she was a living archive of the town's unofficial history. As Ellie pulled up to the neat but modest home, her nerves nearly got the better of her. What if Grace refused to speak with her? What right did she have to dig up painful memories? Before she could knock, the door opened. A small, dignified woman with silver hair and piercing dark eyes regarded her steadily. Finally, Grace Washington said with a slight smile, "I thought you'd never come." Stunned, Ellie struggled to find words. "You were expecting me?" "Not specifically you," Grace replied, opening the door wider. "But someone, eventually. Truth has a way of finding daylight, no matter how deep it's buried." Grace's living room was warm and inviting, walls covered with photographs spanning decades. She motioned Ellie to a comfortable chair and sat across from her. "I imagine you have questions," Grace said, "but first, show me what you found." Hesitantly, Ellie removed the wedding photograph from her purse. Grace's reaction was immediate, her eyes filled with tears as she gently took the image. "Marcus Montgomery," she whispered, touching the man's face with trembling fingers. "My cousin. The most talented musician this world ever knew, and the bravest man I had the privilege to call family." "Your cousin?" Ellie asked, surprised. Grace nodded. "Second cousin. Our mothers were first cousins." She studied the photograph. "Where did you get this?" "Charles Montgomery left it for me. I just learned he was my great-uncle." Ellie paused. "And I think Marcus might be my grandfather." Grace's eyes widened. "So you're Josephine's granddaughter? The baby's child?" "Baby? You mean my mother?" Grace nodded slowly. Josephine was carrying Marcus's child when it happened. Few people knew. Ellie's head spun with this confirmation of her suspicions. "Please, tell me about them. How did they meet?" Grace's expression softened with memory. Marcus had just returned from Korea, decorated veteran, talented musician with a future brighter than anyone from Willowbrook had any right to expect. She smiled sadly. Then came that rainstorm in April 1957. Josephine Barrett's car got stuck on Willow Creek Road. Marcus happened to be driving by and stopped to help. "And they fell in love," Ellie said. "Not right away. Josephine was proper, cautious daughter of William Barrett, the most powerful man in town. But Marcus..." Grace shook her head fondly. "He was persistent. Said the moment he saw her, he knew she was his future." "Where did they meet?" "It must have been difficult. The old forester's cabin by Oakwood Trail. Only place they could be together without judgment." Grace's eyes grew distant. "Marcus composed his most beautiful melodies there. He once told me, 'Love doesn't see color, Grace, it only sees the heart beating on the other side.' Then they got married. Despite the risks. They knew the danger," Grace confirmed. "William Barrett had made it clear he'd rather see his daughter dead than married to a black man. Those were his exact words when he found out they were seeing each other." Grace revealed how the couple planned to marry secretly and leave immediately for New York, where Marcus had music connections. The ceremony took place in the small black Baptist church on the outskirts of town, with Reverend Johnson performing the service. "Just 5 witnesses present," Grace said. "Me, Charles, Reverend Johnson, and 2 of Marcus's musician friends." The celebration afterward was brief but joyful. Her voice faltered. "I've never seen 2 human beings so radiant with happiness." And then. She couldn't continue for a moment. What happened after they left the church? Ellie asked gently. Grace composed herself. Josephine gave me this just before they drove away. She rose slowly and retrieved a small rusted metal box from a cabinet. Said it was, just in case. Like she sensed something might happen. Inside the box were more photographs, a lock of hair tied with ribbon, and an unfinished letter beginning, "My beloved Marcus, if anything happens to us tonight." She knew they were in danger, Ellie whispered. William Barrett had spies everywhere. Someone must have tipped him off about the wedding. Grace fixed Ellie with an intense gaze. It's time you learned your family's true history, Eleanor. Not just for the past, but for the future. This town built its reputation on bones and blood, while smiling in official photographs. Grace leaned forward. Your grandmother didn't die that night, Eleanor. At least, not the way they said. Ellie felt a chill run through her. What do you mean? The newspaper reported both died in the accident. But Josephine survived. Grace's eyes held decades of pain. And what happened afterward? Her forced marriage to Frank Williams, the erasure of Marcus from her life that was almost crueler than death. How do you know this? Because Josephine came to me, once, in 1962. 5 years after. She had your mother with her, a little girl who was the image of Marcus around the eyes. Grace sighed. She made me promise never to tell anyone while she lived. But it's been 30 years since she passed. And some truths need telling, no matter how late they come. The next morning, Ellie arrived at the Willowbrook Municipal Archives as they opened. Jerry Patterson, the archivist and a former student of hers, greeted her warmly. Mrs. Thompson. What brings you here so early? Research for a personal project, Ellie replied, trying to sound casual. I'm looking into a car accident from 1957, June 12, to be exact. Jerry's eyebrows rose. That's specific. Any particular reason? Family history, she said, not entirely lying. I recently discovered some old newspaper clippings and got curious. Well, you know where everything is. Let me know if you need help. For hours, Ellie combed through dusty file boxes. What she found and what she didn't find told a disturbing story. The official police report on the Montgomery accident was suspiciously brief. It stated that Marcus Montgomery, driving under likely influence of alcohol, lost control of his vehicle on River Bend Road and went into the Willow River. Both occupants drowned. Case closed within 5 days. Several pages had clearly been removed from the file. The medical examiner's report was missing entirely. Most tellingly, the investigation was signed off by Sheriff James Wilkins, a name that triggered another shock of recognition. Wilkins had been her late husband's uncle. Ellie sat back, her head spinning. Had James known? Had her own husband been part of this conspiracy of silence? She found newspaper microfiche from that week. The coverage was minimal and biased. Tragedy follows controversial marriage, read one headline, suggesting the accident was almost an inevitable consequence of their provocative union. No mention that Josephine had survived. Instead, a brief obituary listed her as deceased alongside Marcus Montgomery. A follow-up article a month later mentioned Josephine Barrett Williams' miraculous recovery and unfortunate misidentification after the accident. It announced her marriage to Frank Williams, with no reference to her previous husband. The systematic erasure was chilling in its thoroughness. By late afternoon, Ellie's eyes burned from reading microfilm, but her determination had only strengthened. On her way out, Jerry stopped her. Find what you needed, Mrs. Thompson. Some of it, she answered carefully. Interesting how thin the file was on that accident. Something flickered in Jerry's eyes. Yeah, well, some things from back then, the paperwork has a way of disappearing. Especially if certain families were involved. Certain families? Jerry lowered his voice. The Barretts, the Wilkinses, they ran this town for generations. Still do, in some ways. Ellie thanked him and drove home, her mind racing with implications. As she pulled into her driveway, her heart sank. Her garden, her pride and joy had been destroyed. Plants uprooted, flowers trampled, soil scattered across the lawn. On her doorstep lay a single black rose. She didn't need a note to understand the message. Inside, she called Marcus Reynolds. I need to know everything about Charles Montgomery. Why he kept these records, why he chose me. I can tell you some of it, Reynolds replied. Charles was 16 when his brother married Josephine. He witnessed everything: the ceremony, the celebration, and later, the cover-up. He spent decades collecting evidence, but could never get anyone to listen. Why me? Why now? Reynolds hesitated. Because you're the only living descendant of both Marcus Montgomery and Josephine Barrett. Because he hoped you'd have the courage your grandmother ultimately lacked. Before Ellie could process this, her doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she saw Samantha, looking uncharacteristically upset. Mom, what are you doing? Samantha demanded the moment Ellie opened the door. Richard Barrett called me today. Said you were asking uncomfortable questions about ancient history at the town archives. Richard Barrett called you? Ellie asked, stunned that the current mayor and her distant cousin was monitoring her activities. He's concerned, Mom. We all are. These questions about old accidents could damage the reputations of several respected families, including ours. With the town celebration coming up, is that what matters? Ellie interrupted. Protecting reputations? Maintaining comfortable lies? What lies? Mom, what's gotten into you? Ellie made a decision. For the first time in her life, she would directly confront the carefully constructed narrative of her family and her town. What if it wasn't an accident, Samantha? What if everything you believe about our family is based on a monstrous lie? Her daughter stepped back, shocked by Ellie's intensity. You're not making sense. I'm making perfect sense for the first time in decades, Ellie replied. And I won't stop until I know the truth, all of it. This isn't like you, Samantha said, her voice rising. You've always respected our family's privacy, our town's traditions. Maybe it's time those traditions were examined more closely. Samantha stared at her mother as if seeing a stranger. I don't know what's happening to you, but you need to stop. Before you hurt people. Before you hurt yourself. She turned and left, slamming the door behind her. Ellie stood in her entryway, shaking but resolute. The line had been crossed. There would be no going back to her comfortable life of retirement and routine. She had chosen truth over comfort, justice over acceptance. That night, she called Reynolds again. I need your help. I'm going to continue Charles Montgomery's work. I'm going to find out what really happened on June 12, 1957, and who was responsible. As she hung up, Ellie glanced at the ruined garden visible through her window. The warning was clear, but so was her path forward. For Marcus and Josephine. For her mother, who never knew her real father. For herself. 3 days after her confrontation with Samantha, Ellie received an unexpected invitation. Mayor Richard Barrett, great-grandson of William Barrett, and her distant cousin requested the pleasure of her company for lunch at the Willowbrook Country Club. The formal note, delivered by hand, suggested a friendly conversation about shared family history. Ellie knew it was anything but friendly. The Willowbrook Country Club remained the town's bastion of old money and influence. As the hostess led Ellie to a secluded corner table, conversations quieted briefly. Mayor Barrett rose to greet her, tall, silver-haired, with the confident smile of a man accustomed to getting his way. Eleanor, thank you for coming, he said, kissing her cheek as if they were close relatives. It's been too long since we've had a proper chat. I don't recall us ever having a proper chat, Richard, Ellie replied, keeping her voice pleasant. We've exchanged pleasantries at town functions, nothing more. His smile tightened. Well, family is family, distant or not. And the Barretts have always valued family connections. The conversation remained superficial through the appetizer course. Richard inquired about her retirement, her grandchildren. Ellie answered politely, waiting for his real purpose to emerge. It came with the main course. "Eleanor, I'll be direct," he said, lowering his voice. "It's come to my attention that you've been making inquiries about certain, historical matters. Specifically regarding events from 1957. News travels fast in Willowbrook," Ellie observed. "Small towns," Richard shrugged. "No secrets." "Apparently quite a few secrets, actually." Richard's smile disappeared. "The past is past, Eleanor. Some things are better left undisturbed. Even if those things involve murder." He flinched, quickly glancing around to ensure no one had overheard. "That's an extremely serious accusation." "It's not an accusation yet," Ellie replied calmly. "Just a question I'm investigating." Richard leaned forward. "Let me be frank. I'm prepared to offer a generous sum for any historical documents you may have recently acquired. Enough to ensure a very comfortable retirement. You want to buy my silence. I want to protect this town from harmful speculation based on fragmentary evidence from decades ago." His voice hardened. "And yes, to protect families including yours from unnecessary pain. The truth isn't harmful, Richard. Lies are harmful. Truth." He scoffed gently. "After 60 years? All you'll find are faded memories, incomplete records, and the bitter recollections of people whose perspectives were shaped by the prejudices of their time." When Ellie remained silent, Richard's expression changed. "Willowbrook has always protected its own, Eleanor. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again, and those who open them rarely remain unscathed." The threat, though veiled, was unmistakable. "Are you threatening me, Richard?" "Of course not," he smiled thinly. "Just offering friendly advice from one family member to another." Ellie stood, placing her napkin beside her half-eaten meal. "Thank you for lunch, Richard. It's been illuminating." His voice stopped her as she turned to leave. "Consider carefully, Eleanor. You have a good life here. A respected position in this community. A daughter who's building her own place in town. Would you risk all that for ghosts?" She looked back at him. "Perhaps it's time those ghosts had their say." The next morning, Ellie nearly died. Driving down Cooper's Hill, her brakes failed completely. Only her quick thinking downshifting and using the emergency brake prevented disaster. The mechanic was baffled, especially since she'd had the car serviced just 2 weeks earlier. "Brake line's been cut," he told her privately. "Clean job, professional-like. You want me to call the police?" Ellie declined. Sheriff Tom Williams was Richard Barrett's brother-in-law. That evening, she discovered her computer had been remotely accessed. Files related to her research were missing. The following day, a small explosion in her kitchen blamed on a gas leak charred her cabinets and could have been deadly if she'd been home. The message was clear: powerful people wanted her silent. But Ellie also found unexpected allies. Karen Miller, a determined reporter from the Willowbrook Gazette, contacted her after overhearing a conversation at the town archives. "I've been looking for a story like this my entire career," Karen admitted over coffee at Ellie's kitchen table. "The official histories of towns like Willowbrook are sanitized fairy tales. The real stories, especially about race relations, get buried." Michael Carter proved another valuable ally. The young black historian had recently returned to Willowbrook after completing his doctorate in African American history at Howard University. His research focused on documenting patterns of racial violence in small southern towns during the 1950s and 60s. "What happened to Marcus and Josephine wasn't unique," Michael explained, showing Ellie his meticulously organized research. It was part of a systematic pattern across the South. Interracial couples who had accidents, civil rights advocates who committed suicide, all with investigations quickly closed by local authorities. Through Michael, Ellie gained crucial context for understanding the forces that had aligned against Marcus and Josephine and now against her. "They're still watching you," Michael warned. "The names have changed, but the power structures remain. Are you sure you want to continue?" Ellie thought of the cut brake lines, the computer hack, the gas explosion. Then she thought of the wedding photograph, Marcus and Josephine's radiant faces, their future stolen just minutes after it began. "I don't have a choice anymore," she told Michael. "Some truths demand to be told, no matter the cost." Would you have Ellie's courage to seek the truth even when your own safety is at risk? This story of love and justice is just beginning. Subscribe now so you don't miss a single moment of this emotional journey. Through Michael's connections in the Black community, Ellie gained introductions to 3 elderly residents who had been present on the night of Marcus and Josephine's wedding. Meeting them required careful planning. They were understandably hesitant to speak about events they'd kept silent for 6 decades. Joseph Freeman, 92, had been the church organist. Rachel Turner, 88, had helped Josephine with her simple wedding dress. Walter Dixon, 90, had been Marcus's friend since childhood. They gathered in Walter's small living room, eyeing Ellie with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Why now?" Walter asked directly. "Why dig all this up after so long?" Ellie showed them the photograph of Marcus and Josephine. "Because I just discovered that Marcus Montgomery was my grandfather. Because Josephine was my grandmother. Because their story, your story, was erased from history." The 3 exchanged glances. Rachel reached for the photograph. "She was so beautiful that day. So brave. Everyone tried to talk them out of it, you know. Even Reverend Johnson warned them of the danger. But they wouldn't listen," Joseph added. Marcus said, "If we keep hiding our love, nothing will ever change." Slowly, hesitantly, they shared their memories of that evening. The simple ceremony. The small celebration afterward. And then, the fateful departure. "We saw them leave," Walter said, his voice dropping. "And we saw the 2 cars waiting down the road. They didn't even try to hide. Barrett's big Cadillac and Sheriff Wilkins's patrol car. They wanted us to see," Joseph added bitterly. "They were sending a message, this is what happens when you forget your place." None of them had witnessed what happened at the river, but all had heard rumors in the following days, whispers quickly silenced, stories that contradicted the official account. "Everyone knew it wasn't just an accident," Rachel said. "But who could we tell? The sheriff himself was involved. The newspaper was owned by Barrett's best friend." This testimony strengthened Ellie's resolve, but the most devastating discovery came when she returned home and decided to search her own attic. Among James's belongings, items she hadn't touched since his death, she found a dusty box of photographs. Near the bottom was an image that stole her breath, her late husband, James Thompson, standing beside his uncle, Sheriff Wilkins, at what appeared to be a meeting of the White Citizens Council of Willowbrook, a group that officially didn't exist in town records. The photograph was dated August 1957, just 2 months after Marcus's death and Josephine's supposed accident. On the back, in faded ink, "Maintaining order in uncertain times." Ellie sank to the floor, the photograph trembling in her hands. Had James known the truth all along? Had he married her precisely because of her connection to the Barrett family? Had their entire 40-year marriage been built on a foundation of secrets and lies? She couldn't bear to consider it. The James she knew had been kind, loving, principled. But this photograph suggested a different man, or at least a man capable of compartmentalizing in ways she couldn't comprehend. That night, she could barely sleep, turning the questions over in her mind. The next morning, she called the one person who might have answers about James, his younger brother, Robert. "I need to ask you something, Robert," she said after pleasantries. Did James ever mention anything about the Montgomery accident in 1957? About Sheriff Wilkins's involvement? The long silence told her everything. How did you find out? Robert finally asked, his voice strained. I found a photograph. James with your uncle at a white citizens' council meeting. Another heavy silence. James wasn't like them, Ellie. You have to believe that. He was complicated. It was a different time. Did he know who I was? That my grandmother was Josephine? That my biological grandfather was Marcus Montgomery? I don't know, Robert answered, too quickly to be believable. You're lying, Ellie said quietly. Robert sighed. Uncle Jim told him, yes. Before you two got serious. I think James initially got close to you because of that connection. The family wanted to keep tabs on Josephine's descendants. The admission felt like a physical blow. So our entire relationship was a lie. No. Robert insisted. It might have started that way, but he fell in love with you, Ellie. Genuinely. I watched it happen. By the end, he was keeping things from Uncle Jim, from the whole family, to protect you. Protect me from what? From knowing the truth. He thought it would destroy you. Or perhaps, Ellie thought, it would have destroyed the comfortable life they'd built together, a life that she now realized had been partly constructed as a form of surveillance. I need to know one more thing, she pressed. Did James participate in the cover-up? Was he there that night? No, Robert answered firmly. He was only 16 when it happened. But afterward, he kept quiet about what he learned. We all did. After hanging up, Ellie sat motionless, staring at the photograph of her husband, a man she'd thought she'd known completely. Had there been signs she'd missed? Moments when the mask had slipped? Or had James himself been trapped between family loyalty and his genuine feelings for her? She carefully placed the photograph in the growing file of evidence. Whatever James's motivations had been, they were part of the larger pattern of silence and complicity that had protected the perpetrators for decades. Her investigation had now become intensely personal, not just about justice for Marcus and Josephine, but about understanding the very foundation of her own life and identity. With her world upended by the revelation about James, Ellie knew there was one person she needed to confront, her Uncle Harold, her mother's younger brother and the only surviving member of that generation of the family. At 80, Harold lived in a retirement community just outside Willowbrook, where he'd moved after his wife's death 5 years earlier. Ellie hadn't seen him in months. Their relationship had always been cordial, but distant Harold had followed in William Barrett's footsteps as a banker, embracing the family's position in Willowbrook society, while Ellie had chosen the more modest path of teaching. When she arrived at his apartment, Harold greeted her with surprise. Ellie. What brings you here? I need to talk to you about Josephine, she said, watching his face carefully. About what really happened in 1957. The blood drained from Harold's face. He sank into his armchair, suddenly looking every one of his 80 years. Who's been talking to you? He asked weakly. Ellie placed the wedding photograph on the coffee table between them. I know Josephine married Marcus Montgomery. I know they didn't both die in that accident. I know there was a cover-up. Harold's hands trembled as he picked up the photograph. Where did you get this? Charles Montgomery left it for me. Along with other evidence. Charles, Harold whispered. He never gave up, did he? No. And neither will I. Ellie leaned forward. I need to hear it from you, Uncle Harold. What really happened that night? He shook his head. You don't understand what you're asking. Some things are better left - don't, Ellie cut him off. Don't tell me it's better left buried. Marcus Montgomery was my grandfather. I have a right to know. Harold's eyes widened. You know that too? I know that Josephine was pregnant with Marcus's child when he was killed. That child was my mother. For a long moment, Harold said nothing, just stared at the photograph with tortured eyes. Then, like a dam breaking, words began to pour out. "I was just a boy, Ellie. 15 years old. But I remember every detail of that night." His voice shook. "Father was like a madman when he found out about the wedding. Someone called him, I never learned who. He started making phone calls, pacing, shouting." Harold described how William Barrett gathered a group of men, including Sheriff Wilkins, at their house. They'd been drinking, their voices loud with indignation and slurred with whiskey. "They said they were just going to scare him straight," Harold continued. "Make him understand he needed to leave town and never contact Josephine again. But that's not what happened." Ellie prompted gently. Harold covered his face with his hands. "No. That's not what happened." He explained that he'd overheard conversations in the days that followed the men meeting at their house, drinking to quiet their nerves, piecing together their story. Their plan had been to force Marcus's car to stop on the isolated road near the river, rough him up a bit, and make him sign annulment papers. But Marcus, seeing the headlights behind him, accelerated instead. There was a chase. When Marcus took the curve too fast near Willow Bridge, the car crashed through the railing and plunged into the river. But that wasn't the end, Harold said, his voice barely audible. The car didn't sink immediately. They both got out. And then? Harold looked up, his eyes filled with tears. Father couldn't let them live. Not after that. A white woman married to a black man, his daughter, it would have destroyed everything he'd built. He killed them, Ellie stated flatly. Not them. Him. Harold swallowed hard. Josephine survived. She was so traumatized she couldn't speak for weeks. When they discovered she was pregnant, he trailed off. They arranged her marriage to Frank Williams, Ellie finished. Harold nodded. A distant cousin who agreed to the arrangement for a substantial dowry from father. The story was that Josephine had been visiting relatives in Charleston when she met Frank. A whirlwind romance. And my mother never knew the truth. No one knew except those directly involved. Josephine never spoke about it, not to anyone in the family. She became like a ghost in her own life. Ellie's heart ached for the grandmother she'd known, a quiet, dignified woman who rarely smiled. The secret she'd carried must have been unbearable. Who else is still alive who was there that night, she asked. No one, Harold replied. I'm the last one. And I was just a boy who heard too much. As Ellie stood to leave, Harold caught her wrist. What will you do with this, Ellie? It can't bring him back. It can only hurt people, living people. I haven't decided yet, she answered honestly. But the truth matters, Uncle Harold. It always matters. Driving home, Ellie's phone rang. It was Karen, the journalist, her voice tense with alarm. Someone broke into the newspaper office last night, she reported. They took all my notes, my recorder with our interviews. And they spray-painted a message on the wall, stop while you can. Ellie gripped the steering wheel tighter. The warning was escalating from veiled threats to direct intimidation. Yet each attempt to frighten her only strengthened her resolve. That evening, as she organized her growing file of evidence, a realization hit her with stunning clarity: she wasn't just descendant of a victim. Through her Barrett bloodline, she was also descendant of the perpetrator. Her very existence embodied both sides of this tragedy, the murdered and the murderer. This dual heritage gave her investigation a moral complexity she hadn't anticipated. Justice for Marcus meant exposing the crimes of her own blood relatives. But perhaps that was exactly why Charles Montgomery had chosen her. She alone could bridge this divide, acknowledge both truths, and work toward reconciliation. She picked up the wedding photograph, studying the faces of Marcus and Josephine, so young, so hopeful, so tragically unaware of what awaited them just minutes after this moment of joy was captured. I will make this right, she whispered to them. Whatever it takes. The morning after Harold's confession, Ellie received an unexpected phone call. An elderly woman with a wavering voice introduced herself as Martha Jenkins. "Miss Washington Grace gave me your number," she explained. "I understand you're looking into what happened to Josephine Barrett and Marcus Montgomery." Ellie's pulse quickened. "Yes, I am." "Did you know them?" "Not him. But I knew her. I was Josephine's private nurse after the incident." Martha paused. "I'm 93 now, and my health isn't good. If you want to hear what I know, it should be soon." That afternoon, Ellie drove to Rolling Pines retirement home in the neighboring town of Charleston. Martha Jenkins was frail, confined to a wheelchair, but her pale blue eyes were sharp with memory. "I was just 25 then," Martha began after Ellie showed her the wedding photograph. "A private nurse hired by the Barrett family when Josephine was brought to her aunt's house here in Charleston. They said she'd been in a car accident." Martha described her first impression of Josephine: a beautiful young woman seemingly catatonic with shock, unresponsive to questions or comfort. Her physical injuries included a severe concussion and numerous bruises inconsistent with a simple car accident. "Some of those bruises were handprints," Martha said quietly. "On her arms, her neck. Someone had grabbed her roughly, held her down." For weeks, Josephine barely spoke. Then one night, during a violent thunderstorm that left the power out, something broke through her silence. The thunder and lightning triggered something: panic, terror. She started screaming for Marcus, thrashing in bed. Martha's eyes grew distant with the memory. "I held her, tried to calm her. That's when she started talking. Once she started, it all poured out." Martha's account matched what Harold had described, but with devastating new details. The car had indeed gone into the river after being chased. Marcus managed to help Josephine out through the window before escaping himself. They were swimming toward the bank when headlights illuminated the water. William Barrett shouted, "There they are." Martha recounted Josephine's words. Marcus pushed Josephine toward the shore, pleading with the men to let her go. That's when Sheriff Wilkins struck him in the head with a tire iron. Martha's voice faltered. Josephine said the water around Marcus immediately turned dark with blood. She tried to swim to him, screaming his name as he sank beneath the surface. But her father grabbed her by the hair and dragged her onto the bank. When she continued crying out for Marcus, he struck her hard enough to knock her unconscious. The official story was carefully constructed: a tragic accident where the inexperienced driver lost control on a dangerous curve. No one questioned why Marcus's body showed a blunt force trauma to the head inconsistent with the accident, or why Josephine was quickly sent away from Willowbrook. Martha reached for a small box beside her chair. "Before I left Charleston, Josephine gave me this. Made me swear to keep it safe until it was right to reveal it." Inside was a simple gold wedding band with the initials MM and JM engraved inside. The ring still bore dark stains: dried blood. She wanted to keep it, but her father searched her belongings regularly, Martha explained. She was terrified he'd find it. "This is evidence of murder," Ellie whispered, holding the ring carefully. Martha nodded. "There's more." About a month after the incident, William Barrett visited Josephine in Charleston. He brought Frank Williams with him and announced she would marry him immediately to preserve the family's honor. When she refused, William threatened that unfortunate accidents might befall her younger siblings if she didn't cooperate. Ellie felt sick at this new revelation: not just murder, but continued coercion and threats. "The most heartbreaking part," Martha continued, "is that Josephine tried to take her own life. Twice. The first time, she cut her wrists with broken glass. I found her in time. The second attempt was when she learned they were forcing her to marry Frank. She tried to swallow a bottle of sleeping pills." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "Then she discovered she was pregnant with Marcus's child. That baby your mother, I presume, gave her a reason to live. She agreed to marry Frank on the condition that he would accept the child as his own and never reveal the truth. And he agreed. For enough Barrett money, yes. The marriage was backdated in the announcement to make the timing of the pregnancy seem appropriate. Martha reached for Ellie's hand. I've carried this secret for 66 years. Sometimes I wake up hearing Josephine's screams from that night during the storm. She begged me to tell someone someday, when it was safe. I wonder if it's ever truly safe to speak such truths. As Ellie prepared to leave, Martha made one final, chilling revelation. Josephine believed her father never intended for either of them to survive that night. The only reason she lived was because someone in the group she never knew who objected when William moved to strike her a second time as she lay unconscious on the riverbank. That's enough, Bill, she's your daughter, they said. Ellie drove home in silence, the weight of these revelations pressing down on her. The ring, wrapped carefully in a handkerchief, felt heavy in her purse, physical evidence of the crime, bearing Marcus's blood and their entwined initials. The case she was building had moved beyond family history. This was premeditated murder, conspiracy, witness intimidation, and decades of cover-up involving the most powerful families in Willowbrook. And somewhere in this web of deceit was the answer to another question that increasingly haunted her: had her husband James been part of protecting this secret throughout their marriage? Had his entire relationship with her been built on a foundation of surveillance and control? With each piece of evidence, Ellie moved closer to a truth so dark it threatened to consume everything she had believed about her family, her marriage, and her town. Yet she could not turn back now. The voices of the dead end of those who had lived with silence truth demanded to be heard. With all the evidence now gathered, Ellie faced her greatest challenge, deciding what to do with the truth. This wasn't just about historical justice anymore. The blood-stained wedding ring, Martha's testimony, Harold's confession, and the supporting documents from Charles Montgomery's collection constituted evidence of murder, conspiracy, and decades of cover-up involving Willowbrook's most prominent families, including her own. Ellie organized a private meeting at Marcus Reynolds' Richmond law office. She invited Karen, Michael, and after much deliberation Samantha. Despite their argument, Ellie couldn't proceed without giving her daughter the chance to hear the truth directly. Samantha arrived last, her expression guarded. I'm only here because you said it was important, Mom. I still think you're making a mistake digging into ancient history. It's not ancient history when it shaped who we are, Ellie replied quietly. Please, just listen. For 3 hours, Ellie methodically presented her case, starting with the wedding photograph and working through each piece of evidence. She played recordings of her interviews with Grace, Harold, and Martha. She showed the documents from the municipal archives with their suspicious gaps. Finally, she placed Marcus's blood-stained ring in the center of the table. Samantha, initially skeptical and defensive, gradually fell silent as the evidence mounted. When Ellie revealed that Marcus Montgomery was their biological grandfather, making them direct descendants of both victim and perpetrator, Samantha paled visibly. This can't be real, she whispered. These are just stories from very old people, memories warped by time and bias. We can't possibly know what actually happened. It was then that Marcus Reynolds produced an envelope that had been sealed in Charles Montgomery's safe deposit box for almost 4 decades. Charles Montgomery anticipated your skepticism, Reynolds explained, opening the envelope. This is why he spent his life collecting evidence, not just memories, but documentation. Inside was a letter, written by Thomas Reed in 1982 on his deathbed. Reed had been one of the men present that night, a friend of William Barrett who later moved to Florida. Racked with guilt as he faced his own mortality, Reed had written a full confession and sent it to Charles Montgomery, the only person who had never stopped asking questions. Reynolds read the confession aloud. Reed detailed how the men had planned only to frighten Marcus, to force him to annul the marriage and leave town. But when the car crashed and the couple survived, William Barrett made a fateful decision. We can't let them live now, Reynolds read Reed's account of Barrett's words. They've seen our faces. They'll talk. Reed described how Barrett ordered Sheriff Wilkins to finish it when Marcus and Josephine were struggling in the water. Wilkins struck Marcus with a tire iron while Barrett dragged his daughter from the river. When she fought back, screaming Marcus's name, Barrett hit her hard enough to render her unconscious. None of us planned to kill anyone that night, Reynolds continued reading, but when the moment came, we acted like animals, not men. I carry this weight on my soul and know I will find no peace even in death. The silence following the reading was profound. Karen wiped tears from her eyes. Michael stared at the table, jaw clenched in anger. Samantha sat motionless, her face ashen. "What do you plan to do with all this, Mom?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible. Ellie took a deep breath. The truth needs to be known. Not just for justice for Marcus and Josephine, but because Willowbrook has built its identity on a lie. The town celebrates its history and traditions while hiding the horrors committed in the name of those same values. "You realize what this will do?" Samantha said. "It will tear the town apart. It will destroy reputations, legacies including ours." "Some legacies deserve to be destroyed," Michael interjected firmly. "Some reputations have been preserved at the cost of justice." Samantha turned to him. "Easy for you to say. It's not your family being exposed as murderers." "No," Michael replied evenly. "Just my people being murdered with impunity for generations." The tension in the room was palpable. Ellie reached for her daughter's hand. "Samantha, I understand your fear. But we can't heal what we won't acknowledge. Willowbrook has a cancer at its core, a history of violence and injustice that's been deliberately hidden. The town can't truly move forward until it faces its past honestly." "And what about us?" Samantha asked. "What happens to us when everyone knows we're descended from both the murderer and his victim? That our entire family history is built on a lie?" "We tell the truth about that too," Ellie said softly. "We acknowledge both parts of our heritage, the courage and love of Marcus and Josephine, and the terrible actions of William. We can't change the past, but we can honor it honestly and try to make amends." As the meeting concluded, they agreed on next steps. Reynolds would prepare legal documentation of their findings. Karen would draft a comprehensive article. Michael would integrate this case study into his broader research on patterns of racial violence. And Ellie would prepare to present their findings at the town's sesquicentennial celebration in 2 weeks, an event meant to honor Willowbrook's proud traditions, including the Barrett family legacy. The risks were enormous. Mayor Barrett and his allies would fight back with everything they had. The town might turn against them. Ellie's reputation, built over decades of teaching and community service, could be destroyed. As everyone departed, Samantha lingered. "I need time to process this," she told her mother. "I'm not saying I agree with what you're planning, but I understand why you feel you have to do it." It wasn't support, exactly, but it was acknowledgement, a first step. That night, alone in her house, Ellie felt the full weight of her decision. For 66 years, Marcus Montgomery had lain in an unmarked grave, his very existence erased from history. For just as long, Josephine had lived a life imprisoned by secrets and coercion. Their love story, which should have been celebrated, had instead been buried under layers of lies and threats. "No more," Ellie whispered to the empty room. "No more silence." The morning of Willowbrook's sesquicentennial celebration dawned clear and bright. Main Street was decorated with banners celebrating 150 years of tradition and excellence. The town square, where the opening ceremony would take place, was filled with chairs facing a stage where Mayor Barrett and other dignitaries would speak before unveiling a new monument honoring the town's founding families. Ellie watched from her kitchen window as townspeople in their Sunday best made their way toward the celebration. Her own name was on the program, listed as Eleanor Thompson, town historian, scheduled to give remarks on Willowbrook's educational legacy. Mayor Barrett had no idea she planned to use that platform for something entirely different. The past 2 weeks had been intense. Reynolds had organized their evidence into an airtight case. Karen had prepared her article for publication. Michael had created visual aids documenting the pattern of similar covered-up crimes across the South. They had made copies of everything, stored in multiple secure locations, insurance against any last-minute attempts to silence them. Ellie's phone rang. It was Grace Washington. "It's time," the elderly woman said simply. "Are you ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Ellie replied. "Will you be there?" "I wouldn't miss it. Some of us have waited a lifetime for this day." When Ellie arrived at the town square, it was already crowded. On the stage, Mayor Barrett chatted confidently with other town officials. Samantha sat stiffly in the front row, having barely spoken to her mother since their meeting at Reynolds' office. Karen and Michael found Ellie at the edge of the crowd. "Everything set," Karen confirmed. "I've got photographer friends placed throughout the audience, and the article is ready to go live the moment you finish speaking." Michael handed her a flash drive. "All the supporting documentation is here, including a slideshow if you need it." Ellie took a deep breath. "Whatever happens today, thank you both. The truth wouldn't have a chance without you." The ceremony began with the usual pomp: the high school band playing the national anthem, the mayor's welcoming speech celebrating Willowbrook's proud heritage, a reverend offering a prayer for continued prosperity. Throughout it all, Ellie sat calmly, the weight of Marcus's ring heavy in her pocket. When Mayor Barrett introduced her, his smile was confident, unaware of what was coming. "And now," he announced, "we're delighted to hear from our own Eleanor Thompson, retired educator and granddaughter of one of our most respected historical families, who will share reflections on our town's educational tradition." The applause was polite as Ellie took the podium. She surveyed the faces before her: friends, former students, neighbors. People who thought they knew their town's history. People who thought they knew her. "Thank you, Mayor Barrett," she began steadily. "I was indeed invited to speak about Willowbrook's educational legacy. But education, at its core, is about truth. And today, I need to share a truth that has been deliberately hidden for 66 years." A murmur ran through the crowd. Barrett shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Ellie placed the wooden box Charles Montgomery had left her on the podium. From it, she removed the wedding photograph and held it up for all to see. "This is a wedding photograph from June 12, 1957. The bride is my grandmother, Josephine Barrett. The groom is Marcus Montgomery, a black veteran and musician." The crowd's murmur grew louder. 20 minutes after this photograph was taken, Marcus Montgomery was murdered. Not by accident, as the official record states, but deliberately by a group of Willowbrook's most respected men, including William Barrett and Sheriff James Wilkins. Mayor Barrett stood abruptly. "Mrs. Thompson, this is hardly the appropriate venue for unsubstantiated accusations against citizens who can no longer defend themselves." "I have nothing but substantiation, Mayor," Ellie replied calmly, removing documents from the box. "Witness testimonies. Physical evidence. A signed confession from one of the men present that night. And DNA proof that Marcus Montgomery was my biological grandfather." The audience was rapt now, expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to dawning horror. Ellie proceeded methodically through the evidence, just as she had in Reynolds' office. She explained how William Barrett had forced his traumatized daughter to marry Frank Williams after discovering she was pregnant with Marcus's child. How the truth had been systematically erased from public record and family history. "Willowbrook prides itself on tradition," Ellie concluded. "But which traditions? The tradition of violence against those who challenge racial boundaries. The tradition of powerful families covering up their crimes. The tradition of forcing an entire community to participate in a conspiracy of silence." When Mayor Barrett tried again to interrupt, an unexpected voice spoke up. "Let her finish, Richard." Every head turned. Grace Washington had risen from her seat, supported by her cane. "Everything Eleanor Thompson has said is the truth," Grace declared, her voice strong despite her frail appearance. "I was at that wedding. I saw Marcus and Josephine's happiness. And I've lived all these years knowing what really happened to them while we celebrated the very men who committed this crime." One by one, other elderly members of the Black community stood, silently lending their support to Grace's words. The visual impact was powerful. A line of senior citizens, many who had rarely been seen at official town functions, bearing witness with their presence. When Ellie concluded her presentation, a heavy silence fell over the square. Then Mayor Barrett, his face flushed with anger, approached the microphone. "While I appreciate Mrs. Thompson's creative interpretation of historical events, I must remind everyone that these are unproven allegations against revered town founders who cannot defend themselves. This celebration will continue as planned, with the unveiling of our new monument." He gestured toward the tarp-covered stone at the edge of the square. But before he could proceed, Michael Carter stepped forward. "Actually, Mayor Barrett, these aren't just allegations." Michael's academic authority lent weight to his words. "I've documented 17 similar cases across the South during the same time period. Interracial couples who met with accidents, investigations quickly closed by local authorities, witnesses intimidated into silence. What happened to Marcus and Josephine Montgomery wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic pattern of violence designed to maintain racial boundaries." As debate erupted among the town officials on stage, Ellie noticed Samantha rise from her seat and walk purposefully toward the podium. Her heart clenched. Would her daughter publicly denounce her? Instead, Samantha took the microphone, her expression resolute. "I am Samantha Williams Thompson," she announced. "My family carries both the blood of the perpetrators and the victims of this tragedy." Her voice steadied. "I cannot change what my ancestors did, but I can choose to face the truth and work toward a Willowbrook that truly honors the memory of all its citizens, not just those whose stories are convenient to tell." In the days following Ellie's revelation, Willowbrook existed in a state of upheaval. The story exploded beyond the town's boundaries when Karen's article was published in the state newspaper. News vans lined Main Street, and reporters sought interviews with anyone connected to the case. Mayor Barrett initially tried to discredit Ellie's claims, but as more evidence became public, his denials grew increasingly hollow. Some townspeople shunned Ellie, blaming her for dragging Willowbrook's name through the mud. Others, particularly from the Black community, expressed gratitude for finally having their unspoken history acknowledged. The division was painful but necessary, the first step in a long-overdue reckoning. A week after the ceremony, Ellie received an unexpected visitor. Mayor Richard Barrett stood on her porch, looking haggard and years older. "May I come in?" he asked, his usual confidence absent. Ellie hesitated, then nodded. In her living room, Richard declined her offer of tea. "I found this in my father's private office after he died," he said, placing a worn leather box on the coffee table. "I never had the courage to open it until now." Inside were more documents related to the case, including correspondence between William Barrett and other powerful men discussing how to manage the situation if the truth about the Montgomery matter ever surfaced. "I always knew there were dark secrets in our family history," Richard admitted, his voice strained. "But I never imagined something this monstrous." He met Ellie's gaze directly for the first time. "I don't know how to live with this, Mrs. Thompson." Her response was gentle but firm, the same way the victims' families have had to live with the consequences for decades, one day at a time, facing the truth instead of burying it. After Richard left, Ellie realized something had shifted within her. The anger that had driven her investigation was giving way to a sense of purpose focused on healing rather than accusation. That purpose found expression in an unexpected opportunity. The State Historical Society proposed creating an exhibition about Marcus and Josephine's story. Initially hesitant, fearing their tragedy might be exploited, Ellie agreed under the condition that the exhibition would celebrate their love and courage, not just document their victimization. Working with historians and curators, including Michael, Ellie helped create an exhibit that presented Marcus and Josephine as complete, complex individuals. She donated Charles Montgomery's box of mementos and Martha's preservation of Josephine's possessions, including the unfinished love letter. During preparation, they made a remarkable discovery in Charles Montgomery's papers, original musical compositions by Marcus. Michael found a talented musician to interpret them, and after 66 years, Marcus Montgomery's music was heard again. Thank you for following this emotional journey about love and justice. If you've been moved by Ellie's courage to uncover the truth, please like this video, leave a comment sharing what moment impacted you most, and subscribe to continue receiving these powerful true stories of triumph over tragedy. 1 year after her public revelation, Ellie stood before a new memorial in Willowbrook's town square. Where once a generic monument to the town founders had been planned, now stood a simple but powerful sculpture, two hands intertwined, one black, one white. The plaque told the story of Marcus and Josephine Montgomery briefly but honestly, acknowledging both the crime committed and the community's commitment to truth and reconciliation. The dedication ceremony brought together Willowbrook residents from both sides of the racial divide, many attending their first truly integrated town event. Grace Washington, now 98, sat in a wheelchair in the front row, a living bridge between past and present. Ellie had been asked to speak. As she approached the podium, she saw Samantha and her grandchildren, seated beside Michael and Karen. Their friendship, forged through shared purpose, had deepened over the months of work preparing the exhibition and advocating for the memorial. When I discovered the truth about my grandparents, Ellie began, I wanted justice, perhaps even vengeance. What I found instead was something far more valuable, truth. And with it, the opportunity for healing not just for me and my family, but for all of Willowbrook. She gestured toward the sculpture. Marcus and Josephine had only 20 minutes together as husband and wife before violence tore them apart. They never had the chance to build a life together, to see their daughter grow up, to know their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But their legacy lives in each of us who dares to face uncomfortable truths to build a better world. As Ellie concluded her remarks, the setting sun cast a golden glow over the new memorial. In the diverse crowd, she saw faces of all ages and colors, united in a moment of shared acknowledgement. A small choir, formed of members from both the historically white and black churches of Willowbrook, began singing one of Marcus Montgomery's recently discovered compositions. In that moment, Ellie felt a peace she had never known. The circle that began with her discovery of the wedding photograph was complete. Marcus and Josephine's story, which should have remained buried forever, now lived in the light, a testament to both the shadows of the past and the possibility of redemption through truth and reconciliation. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Ellie's grandson Jason approached her. At 17, he bore a striking resemblance to the young man in the wedding photograph. "Grandma," he said thoughtfully, "do you think they would be proud? Marcus and Josephine?" Ellie touched his cheek gently. "I think they would be amazed to see you, their great-grandson, standing here, knowing the full truth of who you are and where you come from. That's a gift they never had." Jason nodded, his eyes on the intertwined hands of the sculpture. "I'm going to apply to music school next year. Maybe I can play his compositions, keep that part of him alive too." As they walked home together through the streets of a Willowbrook forever changed, Ellie reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had uncovered a terrible truth, but in doing so had found something precious, an authentic identity built on honest acknowledgement of both the beauty and the horror in her family's past. The truth, even when it comes late, is the only path to redemption. Charles Montgomery's words had proven prophetic. Through truth, painful, disruptive, necessary truth, Willowbrook had taken its first steps toward genuine redemption. And somewhere, Ellie liked to believe, Marcus and Josephine were at peace, their love no longer a shameful secret but a beacon of hope for the generations that followed.